Hey, good morning. Well, we said goodbye to Hank the cow dog and Drover. Hope you find another book of that story that you could read at home with your family. And would like to introduce you to one of my favorite writers, Richard Peck. And I found him when I was reading the Newbery list of books. I read that whole list of all those books on there and was rewarded with so many great stories. This continues to be one of my favorite, and I'm dedicating it to Lisa Peterson, who I work with, who when I've read it out loud at school to children, she always makes sure she's there because she loves the story. I'm just going to start it out and hope you enjoy it. You all look wonderful today. Shotgum Cheatham's Last Night Above Ground, 1929, a long time ago. You wouldn't think we'd have to leave Chicago to see a dead body. We were growing up there back in the bad old days of Al Capone and Bugs Marone. Just the winter before, they'd had the St. Valentine's Day Massacre over on North Clark Street. That's a real event. You could look that up. The city had such an evil reputation that the Thompson submarine gun was better known as the Chicago typewriter. But I'd grown to the age of 9, and my sister Alice was 7, and we'd yet to see a stiff. We guessed that most of them were, well, where you couldn't see them, at the bottom of Lake Michigan, wearing concrete overboots. Now we had to travel all the way down to see Grandma Dowdle before we ever set eyes on a corpse. Dad said Mary Alice and I were getting to the age where we could travel on our own. He said it was time we spent a week with Grandma, who was getting on in years. We hadn't seen anything from her since we were little tykes. Being Chicago people, Mom and Dad didn't have a car. Grandma wasn't on the telephone. They're dumping us on her is what they're doing, Mary Alice said darkly. She suspected that Mother and Dad would take off for a week of fishing up in Wisconsin in their absence. I didn't mind going because we went on the train, the Wabash Railroad tracks, cracked bluebird that left Dearborn Station every morning, bound for St. Louis. Grandma lived somewhere in between in one of those towns the railroad tracks cut in half. People stood out on their porches to see the train go through. Mary Alice said she couldn't stand the place. For one thing, at Grandma's, you'd have to go outside to the privy. Do you remember what the privy was? It's where the bathroom was. It stood just across from the Cobb house, a tumbled-down shed full of stuff left there in Grandpa Dowdle's time. A big old snaggle-toothed tomcat lived in the Cobb house, and as quick as you'd come out of the privy, he'd jump at you. Ugh, Mary Alice hated that. I'd hate that. Mary Alice said there was nothing to do and nobody to do it with, so she tagged after me, though I was 2 years older and a boy. We'd stroll uptown in those first days. It was only a short block of brick buildings, the bank, the insurance agency, Moore's store, and the Coffee Pot Cafe, where the old saloon had stood. Prohibition was on in those days. Ask Mother and Dad about Prohibition. They can explain that to you. It meant that selling liquor was against the law, so people made their own beer at home. They still had the tin roofs out over the sidewalk and the hitching rails. Most farmers came to town horse-drawn, though now there were Fords, and the banker, L.J. Wiedenbaugh, drove a humpmobile. It looked like a slow pace to us, but that was before they buried Shotgum Cheatham. He might have made it unnoticed all the way to the grave except for his name. The county seat newspaper didn't want to run an obituary on anybody called Shotgun, but nobody knew any other name for him. This sparked the attention from some of the biggest newspapers. One sent in a stringer to nose around the Coffee Pot Cafe for a human interest story, since it was August, a slow month for news. The coffee pot was where people went to loaf and talk tall, swap gossip. Mary Alice and I were of some interest because we dropped by. We were the kin of Mrs. Dowdle, who never set foot in the place. She said she liked to keep herself to herself, which was uphill work in a town like that. That's what we're doing during this whole corona thing, is keeping ourselves to ourselves. Mary Alice and I carried the tale home with a suspicious type that came off the train in citified clothes and a stiff straw hat. He stuck out a mile and was nosing around about Shotgun Cheatham. He was taking notes. Grandma had already heard it on the grapevine that Shotgun was no more. Though she wasn't the first person people ran to with news, she wasn't what you'd call a popular woman. Grandpa Dowdle had been well thought of, but he was long gone. That was the day she was working tomatoes on the Black Iron Range, and her kitchen was hot enough to steam the calendars off the wall. Her sleeves were turned back on her big arms. When she heard the town was apt to fill up with newspaper reporters, her jaw clenched. Presently she said, "I'll tell you what that reporter's after. He wants to get the horse laugh on us because he thinks we're nothing but a bunch of hayseeds and no-count country people. We are, but what business is that of his?" "Who was Shotgun Cheatham anyway?" Mary Alice asked. "He's just an old probate who lived poor and died broke," Grandma said. "Nobody went near him because he smelled like a polecat," which is a skunk. "He lived in a chicken coop, and now they'll have to burn it down." To change the subject, she said to me, "Here, you stir these tomatoes and don't let 'em stick. I've stood in this heat till I'm half cooked myself." I didn't like kitchen work. Yesterday she'd done apple butter, and that hadn't been too bad. She made that outdoors over an open fire, and she'd put pennies in the cauldron to keep it from sticking. Interesting. Down at the coffee pot, they say Shotgun rode with the James boys. "Which James boys?" Grandma asked. "Jesse James," I said, "and Frank." "They wouldn't have had him," she said. "Anyway, them Jameses were Missouri people. They were telling the reporter Shotgun killed a man and went to the penitentiary." "Several around here done that," Grandma said, "though I don't recall him being one out of town any length of time. Who's doing all this talking?" "A real old humped-over lady with buck teeth," Mary Alice said. "Cross eyes?" Grandma asked. "Well, that'd be Effie Wilcox. You think she's ugly now. You should have seen her as a girl. She'd talk you to death. Her tongue's attached in the middle and it flaps at both ends." Grandma was over by the screen door for a breath of air. "They said he'd notched his gun in 6 places," I said, pushing my luck. "They said the notches were either for banks he'd robbed or sheriffs he'd shot." Was that Effie again? Never trust an ugly woman. She's got a grudge against the world. Said Grandma, who was no oil painting herself. She fetched up a sigh. "All right, I'll tell you how Shotgun got his name. He wasn't but about 10 years old, and he wanted to go out and shoot quail with a bunch of older boys. He couldn't hit a barn wall from the inside, and he had a sty in one eye. They were out there in a pasture without a quail in sight, but Shotgun got all excited being with the big boys, and he squeezed off around and killed a cow. Down she went. If he'd been aiming at her, she'd have died of old age eventually. The boys took the gun off him, not knowing who he'd plug next. That's how he got the name, and it stuck to him like flypaper. That's how I got the name Bubba, not from shooting, but somebody called me that, Orlando Rosales, and it stuck. Any girl in town could have outshot him, and that includes me. Grandma jerked her thumb at herself. She kept a 12-gauge double-barreled Winchester Model 21 behind the wood box, but we figured it had been Grandpa Dowdle's for shooting ducks. And I wasn't no Annie Oakley myself, except with squirrels. Grandma was still at the door fanning her apron. Then came the voice. She said, "Looks like we got company." Take them tomatoes off the fire. This is a great story. It has different language and different ideas. It's quite interesting to read. I dearly love you. I hope you enjoy this book. Have a beautiful day. Bye for now.